thank you everyone for joining us today for After the Takeover, a discussion on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the rise of the Taliban, and its aftermath. I'm Malika Aisha. I'm MADRE's digital content strategist and your host for today. Before we get into it, I'd like to um, offer some context for this space for anyone who may be new to the issues, Mother's work, or what Afghan feminist organizers have done on the ground to address the Taliban takeover and the rollback of their human rights. So, excuse me, after the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan 2 years ago, the Taliban seized control, and this is an outcome that rights advocates in and outside of Afghanistan have predicted. And in the early days of the 20-year war, the fight for women's rights was used as a rationale to invade the region. The U.S. then trained and funded groups in Afghanistan that committed atrocities. They allied with warlords and spent more money on military intervention than women's rights, which is what they had promised to take care of. And so through all these harms, Afghan women and girls were neither centered nor supported. They were instead further victimized. And so Afghanistan's neighbors and the U.S. failed to implement systems to protect Afghans for over 2 decades of occupation. And in the 2 years since the rise of the Taliban, we've seen the rights of women and girls stripped away before our eyes as the Taliban's banned them from schools, employment, public spaces. So Afghan women have long organized to protect their rights, their safe spaces, and each other. Let me see. So immediately following the takeover, MADRE jumped into action, and we connected with our local partners to mobilize emergency aid through our Afghan Women Survival Fund. So MADRE supported emergency evacuation and resettlement of women targeted by the Taliban. We also provided humanitarian aid for women and their families who were facing shortages of food, fuel, and water due to the collapse of the government, COVID-19, and the climate crisis. And today I'm joined by Arash Azizala, the co-founder and co-director for Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, to discuss the U.S.'s responsibility to support Afghanistan seeking to rebuild their country. And I'm hoping that we can also welcome Kate Alexander, MADRE's Policy and Campaigns Officer, to this discussion. So while we get Kate situated, Arash, would you mind giving like a brief introduction of yourself and your work, kind of what you've been kind of working on since the Taliban takeover?
Yeah, thank you to you and all the good folks at MADRE for initiating the discussion. Important discussion falls on a solemn day, I think, and my name is Arash. I, co-founded, I guess, for Better Tomorrow alongside 2 African American women. Who are also in the United States. We're all children of refugees. And we started the organization as a campaign and as an organization out of necessity. I think we ahead of the withdrawal were organizing advocacy alongside Afghan women because we had in the Trump years kind of seen the trajectory that was going to take place, and then the Biden administration made the decision that plan to follow up on it and to withdraw from it. So I think we started it out of necessity because we know that the United States was not meeting its commitments, was not following up on promises it made, and our expectation, rightfully, was that they would throw Afghan kind of under the bus in terms of how it would follow up on its plan to withdraw from Afghanistan. And so since then, we've done kind of advocacy on a state level, on a federal level, on a level. We've advocated for the release of frozen funds. Is committed to resettling Afghans and doing so with, welcoming Afghans with dignity, the dignity that they deserve. And we've done a ton of mutual aid and community organizing. Really grassroots work on a local level throughout. And I also have to say, we're just one organization and a large coalition of folks. Many of them, if not the majority of them, being African Americans. The old diaspora, folks who've been here longer than a few years, who have really done this work for 2 years. And so today kind of marks the 2 years of the fall, but also 2 years of burnout and relentless commitment to doing right by our community. And so, yeah, it's been a long, long 2 years.
It has been, and seeing the updates and the protests and all that followed has definitely been overwhelming, but it's also spurred a lot of hope seeing that people are still organizing and responding to this. And I'd like to follow up with the question of like when the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, how did Afghans already in the U.S. respond to the needs of those still in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we saw, it was obviously deeply personal for Afghans, right? We have a really strong, the Afghan American community personally has some pretty strong ties to our home country, home, as many would call it. A lot of people went back for the past 20 years also, start businesses to kind of try to pick up maybe where they left off, or just traveled back to visit. And it was really the Afghan American community who stepped up to lead evacuation work. What we saw in the days of August is veteran orgs, but mostly Afghan Americans who said, were brainstorming and thinking really deeply and creatively about how to get folks out. I think what was traumatic and painful about that was the fact that, many people had already made that journey. So whether it was getting on a flight to get out of there, which we all know was like really painful and chaotic to see at the airport, but also, how can I get to a third country? How can I get to Pakistan or somewhere else where I can find some level of safety? That journey has already been taken. My father did it in 1980. My mom did it in 1983. My cousin, my grandma, my family members already took the really painful and traumatic journeys. And so I think it was really unfortunate to see that, 40 years later, we were doing the same thing, just now for younger people, for other generations. And then, and consequential to that, it was really Afghan Americans also who welcomed these folks, to try to welcome them with dignity, to find them housing, to find them support, to help these newly arrived folks find community. And now we hear 2 years later, and that work is continuing. What I said earlier about the relentlessness, we've built up capacity and some level of professional resettlement structures that Afghans built for other Afghans, for us, by us. And that work continues. That work continues for that work continues for so many folks in Minnesota, in Southern California, in Northern Virginia, Texas, and other parts of the country have gone. And so now we're at almost 100,000 folks who and have settled.
And sometimes it's disheartening to see how these issues can be intergenerational. Like it's expanding across generations. However, the commitment to change and this passion that follows, it's very clear. And it's how connected the diaspora has been very pivotal for the success of these movements and amplifying the voices of those who are on the ground and supporting the needs of those who are on the ground. And while I hate to say that our elders are reliving or re-seeing these moments happening with such fervor, it's also again so hopeful to see young folk taking on the reins. You know what, we learned from you, we're doing this, and we have more resources to kind of push this work forward. And we got this question a lot from our audience, but also something that we were preparing to discuss here. But what is America's responsibility to Afghans?
Yeah, I mean, I think we think about as at Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, try to take the long arc, but also what comes next. And responsibility, America's specific responsibility to Afghans is basically when we wake up and what we think about down and are done for the day, because pretty much everything that our work revolves around that, America's debt to the Afghan people. And I would say, the United States has a unique and probably a really messed up relationship with Afghans, to put it kindly, not to use the words I really want to use, but that relationship's been ongoing for 40 years, 30
Mm-hmm.
years old. So it's lasted longer than I have ever been alive, or the people that are now doing a lot of resettlement. That relationship has lasted much longer. In the Cold War, America was party to a conflict in the 1980s. My parents fled. They were party to a conflict in the past plus years. And also were responsible for that time period in between from like 1980 to 2001, when really nefarious forces like the Taliban and other organizations, took over Afghanistan. That history is really important. And so when you reflect back on that history, you realize the United States is responsible for a lot of the harm that has been caused in Afghanistan. It's not the only party responsible, but as an Afghan American and as an American taxpayer and as somebody who's part of civic life here in America with Afghan roots, it's my job and it's our job, I think, to ensure that debt to the Afghan people. And so what we try to push for is reparative policies that fix that harm. The United States has done that with other populations. We look at America's history with African Americans, transatlantic slave trade, and its treatment of indigenous, the internment of Japanese Americans. There are plenty of examples in the United States of America harming, inflicting a lot of pain and harm and violence on communities. Afghans just fall into that category as well. And so I think to fix that harm, the United States must work hard to apologize, but really to invest and to divest from what has failed in the past, which is military power, drone strikes, and it's throwing around its military weight that ended up killing so many people, and it ended up with the Taliban controlling the entirety of the country. And I think at the bottom of that, the floor of that is passing the Afghan Adjustment Act, which would give the folks that have arrived here a pathway to legal status. And that's really the floor, right? Like that is the bottom. That's the minimum the United States ought to do to fix that harm. And then we can move up from there. And so, when we talk about what America owes, that's the very first thing that we talk about is that piece of bipartisan legislation that's supported by people like Senator Klobuchar, but also Lindsey Graham on the other side of the aisle. It's also supported by plenty of House Democrats and Republicans. I always invite people to tell me about other pieces of legislation that have such broad and
right.
Because the failure that also happened in Afghanistan, I think, bipartisan, both parties are responsible for that. So at the bottom of that is pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, and then we can have a conversation about the other debt that America owes. Just plenty.
Absolutely. And for those who are interested in learning a little bit more about the Afghan Adjustment Act, MADRE has a carousel that gives a little bit more information of what that act would do. And just apply pressure to your senators and all those who are who can really influence these policies. And I think it's I really appreciate how you answered this question, because one of the questions that we got from an audience member was, how are we defining the U.S.'s deep betrayal? And it's like, is it because they left Afghanistan or that they did nothing to help? And I think you've emphasized quite nicely that it's not just about like the U.S. withdrawing its troops. It's been the systemic harms that even transcended the 20-year war. It was 40 years of influence that have really destabilized the region and that committed harms that seem irreparable without the support of those who have invoked that harm. So I definitely really appreciate that. And I hope BDCRs that you feel that your question was answered. I really appreciate that insight. I do want to, let's see, we have more questions. We're still trying to sort out getting Kate here, y'all. So just if y'all are waiting for her, please feel free, give us all of your spirit and hopes and all that, and that we can get her here. I would like to ask, do you feel like the Biden administration has met its requirements to resettling Afghans? I know like a big part of of the U.S. response has been helping to evacuate or secure resettlement things for Afghans. But I want to know kind of your perspective on this.
It's a good question, and I think it's a complicated, but the short answer is no. And the reason I say no is because it was the Biden administration who evacuated these people. President Biden made the decision to withdraw in the way that it did, placing no judgment on the withdrawal itself, actually. And so when you take on that responsibility, I think also have a debt to pay in terms of like what resettlement looks like. And I think it's failed for a variety of reasons. I think they've earned maybe a D or D plus in that sense. It's not a total F, but it's not a passing grade. I mean, one, there is no legal status for these folks, right? And so people live in legal limbo and a lot of anxiety about what comes next for them. You might have to re-parole again, which is a process that folks are going through now, which is kind of going through a really complicated online form. They have to make an account. Every single person has to do that in their family. It's not that straightforward of a process. It's burdensome, and so this is why I brought the Afghan Adjustment Act earlier. And this is the White House's responsibility to ensure that prioritize within the Democratic Party, for example. That there's folks who oppose it, but it's the Democrats and the White House that they run the Senate and they own the White House at the moment. So it really comes down to them. And then the second part to that is that when we talk to folks and hear stories, it's a mixed bag. Like I think folks are deeply grateful. They carry a lot of grace when they talk about resettling the United States because they're grateful that they're here. And at the same time, I think they've been confounded and perplexed by the lack of an Afghan Adjustment Act. Being placed in communities where there's hostility towards them. The one thing that we come across is that Afghans were relocated in 49 states and the District of Columbia. So there are places like Wyoming or Nebraska or Alaska, and also like places where there's really large. But what we come across often is bullying. Almost 30 to 40% of the folks that came here of that are under the age of like 21 or 18. So it's a really young population that is trying hard to acclimate. But when you're being bullied in school because you are felt to be traditionally Afghan or Muslim, and the xenophobia and the racism and the Islamophobia kind of perks its ears up. And that one is hard to kind of wrap. And again, I go back to the piece about investing in us, in our community, in Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, or Afghan Cultural Society in the Midwest, or Afghan Refugee Relief in Southern California, or Fresh Start in places like North Carolina. They're the ones on the ground doing the grassroots work of reset. Doing so with sensitivity, with dignity, but still under-resourced. So I think that's where the administration ought to do better. And that responsibility also lies not just with this administration, state government, county governments. It really was deeply carried through all broads of American society and America's elected officials throughout the country, and so that debt that is owed. One way to fix that harm and repair, we're talking about repairing today. One way to do that is to invest in the organizations I named in the Afghan community to ensure that resettlement is done successfully. Because what we are seeing now is less investment, less resources than other wartime populations have. that's why I gave the administration a D, maybe D plus.
Yeah, yeah. B plus seems like a solid grade. I mean, I feel like that's also generous, but we've got a question from pro-choice Pakistan. So, as an active party to the conflict, is the U.S. government the right target for advocacy of holding the Taliban accountable for their ongoing crimes? Who else can act as a pressure group instead of the U.S. or the
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and then one we grapple with. I think, uh, yeah, the United States is not the only party to that conflict and the only party responsible. And one avenue that we've always advocated for using, which remains deeply kind of just like deeply ignored, especially by the United States, is international tribunal in The Hague. You know, the ICC play a pivotal role in bringing justice. You know, because what Afghans know is indignity, impunity, and no accountability. There's been almost little to no, uh, and I'll share a story when my family moved to the Netherlands in the mid '80s. So I was born in the Netherlands, but Afghan refugees in Holland, in the Netherlands, would start to walk, and like they would run into their torturers and war criminals because the Netherlands would also take in really vicious people who had committed war crimes or had tortured people, who had tortured their family members. This is a really common thing that the experience that happened in Western Europe. And it just speaks to the lack of accountability. So, to kind of bring it back, the U.S. deeply opposes the use of the ICC in order to protect its own soldiers and it might be part of any wars, but we've advocated for the use of the ICC as this neutral arbiter to bring about accountability and justice. And so the Taliban also right now is committing deep crimes, trying to erase women from the public sphere, from the economy. It's such a unique case of gender apartheid. Iran is trying to do it too, but it's almost unparalleled what is happening in where women can't even work for a UN agency or humanitarian organization.
Right.
And so, I think utilizing instruments such as are a step forward, but it requires the U.S. to actively participate in that as well and to not oppose that process. We see kind of with Ukraine and Russia, the U.S. is interested in submitting evidence to the ICC because of Russia's war crimes. Russia should be held accountable. And our argument is that it doesn't really matter responsible. We know who it is in our community, Taliban at the very moment, and the U.S. for its sins in the past. And so whoever is responsible, they might also be Afghans, by the way. There's a lot of Afghan national warlords who have gotten away with that lack of accountability. So whoever they may be, if they're guilty, they should be charged and they should be tried at the international tribunal.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate your patience with the technical challenges that we've been having today, despite our best efforts. My name's Kate Alexander, she, her pronouns, and I am the Policy and Campaigns Officer at MADRE. I get to work with the lovely Malika, who has been your host for this noon special on the second anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban. We are working now to make sure that the coalition that I've been able to work with in DC on U.S. foreign policy around the Afghanistan withdrawal, which includes Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, an incredible diaspora-led organization focusing on the rights of Afghans in the U.S., is represented on this call as well. And in terms of Afghanistan, the work that we've been able to do together is to really make sure that we're advocating for the rights of the Afghans who are in a legal limbo status in the US and abroad, to make sure that we're recognizing the dire human rights crisis that the Afghan women human rights leaders that MADRE has been working with for decades are continue to be represented and have representation in U.S. policy discussions of Afghanistan, a space where they have been woefully underrepresented and under-resourced, not just since the withdrawal, but over the past, really, now 22 years.
Thank you, Kate. So it looks like we're having another technical difficulty. I don't think our account can hold two different speakers at the same time, or three different speakers at the same time. So we might have lost Arash for a little bit. So maybe we can just answer a few questions and we can do like another switch, and it'll be a fun little game of musical chairs. Again, thank y'all for your patience. Kate, just another question for you. It looks like the war effort was really sold to the U.S. as a way to save Afghan women. Do you feel like that promise was kept? We talked a little bit about it earlier with Arash, but would like to hear your thoughts as well.
I mean, the quick answer is no. The quick answer is absolutely not. Not only was that promise never kept, that promise was never legitimate. That promise was always about how can Afghan women be really tokenized by the US in order to sell the US public and the global community on the idea that a war can be waged for women, when in fact, even at the time, MADRE and Afghan women partners knew that that was not the case. The truth is the US invasion of Afghanistan was never about Afghan women. It was not about Afghan women when Laura Bush said it was. It was not about Afghan women for 20 years. It was not about Afghan women during the peace process. And it was not about Afghan women during the withdrawal. And it's not about Afghan women today. You know, Afghan women's rights were cited as justification for the invasion, but that did not stop the US from making deals with warlords who abused them. It didn't keep the US from devoting almost 1,000 times more money on military spending in Afghanistan than on women's efforts. And it didn't stop the US from ignoring warnings from Afghan women's civil society that without their inclusion in the peace process, the Afghan government would be weaker. As early as 2019, Afghan women human rights defenders like former Afghan parliamentarian Rahima Jami were warning that the lack of inclusion of women's civil society in the peace talks would weaken the Afghan government. And the truth is the US already knew better. We had commitments on the books. In 2017, the US passed the Women, Peace and Security Act, and it mandated a government-wide strategy on women, peace, and security. The US Departments of State, Defense, and USAID all had agency-wide strategies for the inclusion of women for the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. And none of this was enough. None of this was enough for Afghan women to be prioritized in the peace process. None of this was enough for the US to heed the warnings of Afghan women human rights defenders who were saying that they were being tokenized in that process and not given any real power or representation at the table. And this wasn't enough despite there being global studies that when peace agreements have civil society representation and women's participation, they are 64% less likely to fail. We're not talking about Afghan women's rights as just as an issue that only affects women. This is a best practice in peace building that the US systematically ignored for 2 decades. And it continues to be ignored as Afghan women are frankly shut out and deprioritized of conversations about the impacts of US withdrawal today. So no, is the short answer.
Thank you for that. That was, I mean, listen, it is what it is. And like, that's the honest answer. No, it hasn't. And another one of our questions, which also comes up, and it's also come up from Anita Irvin, it's like, what are the conditions that Afghan women and girls are facing now in Afghanistan 2 years after the withdrawal? And like, what is the level of support among men in Afghanistan for women's rights?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the conditions facing Afghan women and girls are really summarized by the UN, by journalists who have been very clear that Afghanistan is the worst place in the world to be a woman today. Since taking over Kabul, the Taliban has issued more than 50 edicts against Afghan women and girls, and more than that, to enforce a rigid gender ideology that doesn't just impact Afghan women and girls, but also impacts the LGBTQ community as well as men. Members of the Taliban are committing torture and other inhumane acts against women, men, girls, boys, and the LGBTQ community. And these acts amount to the crime of gender persecution. Gender persecution is a really important way of documenting the reality of living in Afghanistan today for people who do not adhere to the Taliban's very rigid gender norms. And while we talk a lot about Afghan women and girls because those are key populations for MADRE and many of the people who we've been working with for decades, this really does impact everyone. For example, we did a briefing with USAID and the Department of State about a few months after the withdrawal, and Afghan LGBTQ communities are in hiding. And it's one of the reasons why is because family members and community members are really incentivized to turn them in or face violence themselves. So in a situation like that, MADRE and other organizations with a long history of working in these areas are more important than ever to meet the conditions on the ground today, because who else can answer this question of how do you get aid to communities in hiding? You cannot build trust with communities that are already hidden from the public eye. You can't parachute in and find them, which is why MADRE's model has just been so important in meeting the needs. And some of the ways that we continue to meet the needs is through documentation and getting a really clear view of what is happening on the ground. So, for example, we have been working with CUNY Law School as well as partners on the ground in Afghanistan to document crimes against humanity that fall under gender persecution in Afghanistan that have really resulted in the loss of 3 fundamental rights. The right to education, the right to assembly, and the right to expression. And just to give a couple of examples of what this looks like. So the Taliban has restricted women and girls from sitting for university entrance exams. Now, I want you to think about what it would mean to dream of a life as a doctor, as a journalist, and then to go through your years of schooling for that goal and then be told no. It's really it's not just a matter of restricting educational opportunities and employment opportunities in the middle of a humanitarian crisis. It's a matter of restricting dreams, of restricting the idea that women and girls have a role to play in public life in the country. And the way that they're enforcing these bans are barbaric. They have killed and beaten teachers and school officials, sprayed students and teachers with acid, and committed torture, inhumane acts, enforced disappearance, unlawful imprisonment against supporters and allies of girls' education. Now, but despite the risks, Afghan women and girls are continuing to protest. And I want to make sure that that's clear everywhere where MADRE is speaking. Afghan women and girls, they are not just survivors and victims. They are the most resilient activists and organizers, despite being displaced all around the world, being in legal limbo. They are continuing to organize for accountability for the Taliban and for the rights of Afghan women and girls still in country, as well as those stuck in legal limbo and unable to make ends meet, including in the US because of a really perilous legal status. So while they're facing tremendous rights violations in country, while they're facing tremendous rights violations while being displaced, particularly, let's say, in Pakistan, where that does not recognize refugees, where women and girls have to go back across the border every 2 months into Afghanistan to get visas renewed, facing incredible violence at the border. The US has a much larger role that we need to play diplomatically to make sure that we're protecting the rights of Afghan women and girls, if that was ever our priority.
Thank you for that. And I guess that kind of lost my thought for a second. We have a good list of questions here, honestly. Um, and I guess I will also ask, um, and this is a question from Faradun Wahidi, and a question that we also have prepared for y'all. So how has MADRE supported, or how does MADRE support partners who are at risk of Taliban persecution after the withdrawal? Human rights defenders are in danger in the area, and like, what are MADRE's plans to address, like, I guess, the prejudice against Afghan women and what's being done for the Afghan people? So it's like, what are we doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in the 6 months after the Taliban takeover in August 2021, Madre built on existing long-term relationships with Afghan women, human rights leaders, and civil society leaders in country to rapidly expand emergency support and to make sure that Afghan women were represented in international coalition spaces and in advocacy channels wherever they landed. So one way that this support materialized was supporting Afghan women and girl activists, human rights defenders, and their families who were experiencing conflict, economic disparity, and also drought, because we're talking about Afghanistan, reaching nearly 6,500 Afghan women and girl activists in country and as refugees in just the first 6 months after the withdrawal. This looked a lot like providing support for relief efforts like life-saving aid, like fuel, medical care, clothing, food, water, menstrual products, which are often not prioritized in general aid packages, but are absolutely essential healthcare, particularly in a situation where Afghan women and girls are fleeing. And we weren't just reaching Afghan women and girl populations, we were reaching LGBTIQ populations, we were reaching, in particular, we were able to provide relocation, shelter, and safe passage for over 1,000 women and girl human rights defenders and activists, including their families, which is a particular need for Afghan women human rights defenders because, as we know, women often have care responsibilities. And there were many Afghan women human rights defenders who needed to leave because they were at particular risk of violence from the Taliban, but they couldn't leave because of the care responsibilities that they had for children in their family, as well as for elders in their family. So in that case, MADRE mobilized resources to either meet financial needs for those human rights defenders in country and the needs of their family, or evacuation needs to get not just the Afghan woman human rights defender out, but also her dependents. We also created a guide on leaving Afghanistan safely for those in country facing life-threatening risks. And today, we continue to do work both in country in terms of supporting life-saving emergency aid, but also documenting the ongoing human rights violations Afghan women and girls and the LGBTQIA plus community is facing through documentation reports, through trainings with human rights defenders still in country, so that we and other human rights organizations internationally really have a record that we can take to tribunals like the International Criminal Court to get accountability for the reality of human rights violations that Afghan women, girls, and the LGBTQIA community is facing in country.
Thank you. Listen, every time I hear about the work that we're doing, I'm just always just like, whoa. And like those who are on the ground who have initiated like these collaborations or even these actions, it's just wow.
Yeah.
Again, like lots of words. And that brings me to a question of what can folk who aren't MADRE staff, who are, our average person who maybe is into organizing or into supporting those who are on the ground, like how can the average person take action and support Afghan women and Afghan people?
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry that like Arash can't be a part of this conversation because like Afghans for a Better Tomorrow is even doing like a hijab drive right now for recently resettled Afghans in New York City. So there's everything from how do you support Afghans locally through like meeting immediate needs to how do you support legal structures locally at your state level, federally, to support the safety and long-term security of Afghans who are in the US. And for that, the answer is pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. It's way past time for the US to do right by these communities to make sure that people aren't stuck in a status of legal limbo. I mean, we have people who are waiting like 4 or 5 years to get their cases heard because the US humanitarian parole cases are so deeply backlogged. And that's completely unjust when you're talking about communities that are fleeing violence, trying to find safety in the US, but they don't find safety here either. In fact, if they get to the US by crossing the southern border, they're actually facing even more violence on their way to the US. That simply has to stop. So passing the Afghan Adjustment Act is a huge way for us to support Afghans who are already in the US to make sure that they don't feel like the rug is going to be pulled out from under them in like a month, 2 months. And at the international level, it really is about making sure that the spaces where we're talking about Afghanistan continue to be or start to be inclusive of Afghan women. Like, if there is a space that's talking about Afghanistan that is not including Afghan women, it simply isn't good enough. We know that inclusion is a peace building best practice. Anything else is simply wrong and will create situations like we just saw where we build and then it collapses. It builds and it collapses. That is not sustainable, not just for Afghanistan, but it's not sustainable for US policy. And we have a responsibility to learn from our mistakes now, incorporate the lessons of the last 20 years, and make sure that Afghan women are involved in political processes around Afghanistan. And if you see spaces where they are not being included, those spaces should be shamed, quite frankly. We have a responsibility to do better. Afghan women are demanding that we do better. We cannot afford for the international community to continue to ignore the recommendations of Afghan women. And it's up to us as a global movement showing solidarity with Afghan women to make sure that we are lifting up their demands when they are made. And that is the clearest demand that is coming from Afghan women. Afghan women are not a monolith. I don't want to suggest that they are, but there are certainly trends in what is being asked for. And one is inclusion is the bottom line. It's just the bottom line. It's the least they are entitled to. It's the least we can provide. Let's make sure that international spaces accommodate the concerns of Afghan women that they are so bravely raising over and over again, from literally still the streets of Kabul to like communities all around the world.
Absolutely. That is a word. Oh my gosh. That is a word.